Well, let's see if this microphone is working. Well, it appears to be. So let's see if you can do better for me than you can for the pastor. Good evening.
Good evening.
All right. You're getting the right idea. By Wednesday, I expect a real crescendo. Hello? Well, tonight we're going to talk about a topic that is very, very near and dear to me. There's absolutely no truth to global warming, global cooling, climate change being caused by human beings. Everything that we see is actually simply natural cycles which God has put into nature at the beginning of creation and environmentally changed at the time of the flood. So I want to start off, remember that we must always use the Bible as our authority, correct? And therefore, let's talk about what God has to say in part. In fact, I'll share a couple of verses with you, but really there's about 36 verses of the Bible that says that God is in charge of the weather. Now, if he's in charge of the weather, we are not. Agreed? But let's just start with this one, Genesis 8:22. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. Period. Hello? I'd like to put an exclamation point on the end of that. But on the other hand, let's take a look at what the environmental terrorists have to say. Now, environmental terrorists are trying to control your life for no good reason whatsoever, and they want to make you afraid of things so that they can control what you do. And let's just take a look at this statement. This is a statement from the former U.S. Senator Tim Wirth, Democrat of Colorado. He was the U.S. Undersecretary for Global Affairs during the Clinton administration, and he said this: "We've got to ride the global warming issue. Even if the theory is wrong, we will be doing the right thing." Hello? Even if the theory is wrong, we're going to be doing the right thing. You start to see this as a political agenda. This is not science. Now, with that in mind, is it true that global warming, climate change are caused by people? Well, you already know the correct answer. It's no. Hello? But let's just take a little look. We are experiencing normal global weather fluctuations. This is a chart that was used by Al Gore in his famous May 2006 movie, An Inconvenient Truth. The fact of the matter is, it was mislabeled. It should have been titled An Inconvenient Lie. There was not one truth in the entire movie except his name. Hello? But please notice, this is a chart showing that, today, this green bar, we are in the modern warm period here, but previously we had what's called the Little Ice Age. People tend to forget this. You only tend to remember the weather that you experienced yourself, and even then you remember it incorrectly. When you were a child, it might have been broiling hot, but you went outside and played anyway because Mama said so. Can I get an amen? But there was the Little Ice Age. It lasted from roughly about 1250, 1300 till about 1895, and it was particularly cold, which is why it's called the Little Ice Age. And then there was the medieval warm period here. Now that lasted from roughly 850 to about 1250. And please notice it was much warmer during that period than it is today, but that is prior to the Industrial Revolution, correct? And then you have, if we go back in time, we have the Dark Ages. Now why is it plural? Because there were two. Notice this big dip, cold, and then it started to come up, and then another bigger dip, cold, right? And so it's it's the Dark Ages because there were two. And then before that, we have what's called the Roman warm period. This is the time of Jesus being born and so forth. So apparently God did want Jesus to have a nice warm birth. And you guys really do need more caffeine. I'm telling you right now. Then before the Roman warm period, which as you'll notice is much warmer than today, well, we have a variation in temperatures, as you would expect. And then back here we have the Minoan warm period, but you and I would call this the Moses-Joshua warm period. This is about the time of the Exodus. And, well, think about it. When they came out of Egypt, God gave them a covering of cloud during the day and fire at night, correct? Well, that was to shade them from the heat. Hello? Come on, God wanted his people to be comfortable. And then before that, they start getting into imaginary time because the earth is only 6,000 years old. They're not taking into account, the flood of Noah, etc. But I think that from the time here of the Minoan warm period, it's a pretty good chart. Now, think with me. There have been these 4 warm periods that we know of. 3 of them, well, they're before the Industrial Revolution. People had nothing to do with them. What are the 2 major driving, and this is what they're called in science, the drivers of weather change? And I'm not talking about day to day, I'm talking about climate, long-term periods. Well, the 2 main things are volcanoes, which always cool the earth if the volcano is above sea level, and will warm the earth if they're below sea level, and sunspots, as I will point out to you. Now, is it true that global warming, climate change are caused by people? Well, no. The earth has been much warmer in the past, and I want to reiterate, this is where we are today. This is the Little Ice Age, and this is the medieval warm period, when it was much warmer, and people obviously had nothing to do with it. Is there scientific consensus that global warming, climate change are true? Now, Al Gore said that there was like 100% consensus among scientists. Now, first of all, if somebody ever tells you that 100% of all scientists believe something, you know they're wrong. Hello? You couldn't get 100% of all scientists to agree that the sun is going to rise tomorrow morning. Just trying to get you to think, folks. But let's think about this. In 2006, Al Gore wrote, he did write the book, and then the movie was made from that, but the degree of scientific consensus on global warming has never been stronger. Wow, aren't you impressed? But the fact of the matter is, consensus is not the same thing as truth. Consensus is not data, and consensus is not the same thing as a scientific fact. Simply because there's consensus doesn't mean it's true. After all, think with me. If there were 100 people in a room, and one was right and 99 were wrong, well, then the 99 are still wrong, even though that's consensus. Agreed? I want to introduce you to Dr. Richard Lindzen. He's the Alfred P. Sloan Professor of Atmospheric Sciences at MIT, member of the National Academy of Sciences USA, former lead author for the United Nations IPCC, which is the International Panel on Climate Change, and he wrote this about global warming. The consensus was reached before the research had even begun. Hello? Yeah, the consensus was reached before the research had even begun. It's a political agenda. It has nothing to do with science. Again, no, the current promotion of global warming, climate change scare is purely a far-left political agenda. Global warming, climate change are just the new slogans to promote socialism and communism. Again, is there consensus that global warming is true? No. An analysis of scientific journals reveals that over 500 scientists have published evidence refuting at least one element of the current man-made global warming scare. More than 300 found evidence that, number one, a natural, moderate, 1,500-year climate change cycle has produced more than a dozen global warming periods similar to ours, and that, number two, global warming is linked strongly to the variations in the sun's irradiance, and in particular sunspot activity. Again, no, the list I'm talking about here may be found in a book by Dennis Avery and Dr. S. Fred Singer. I love the title of this book, by the way. I hope you love it as much as I do. The title of the book was Unstoppable Global Warming Every 1,500 Years. Hello? Unstoppable global warming every 1,500 years. Now, with that in mind, again, no, we have compelling evidence of real world climate cycle averaging 1,470 years, or 1,500. The climate cycle has above all been moderate, and the trees, bears, birds, and humans have quietly adapted. When it gets hotter, you don't wear a coat. When it gets cooler, you wear a coat. You do what people do best, you adapt. Hello? What causes global climate change? Well, the Earth's temperature has been fluctuating up and down for thousands of years because of well-established and documented variations in solar activity combined with volcanic eruptions. Again, if the volcano is above sea level, it will cool the Earth every time. If it's below the sea level and relatively close to the surface, we just recently had that happen, it will warm the Earth for about maybe 5 years. It'll have some warming effect. But this is a rather unusual case. But let's just take a little look. This is a photograph of the sun on my wedding anniversary in 2001. One reason I like to show it. But what you see here is a picture of the sun, and all those black spots up there, those are called sunspots except for one. You see that little one right there? That's the Earth. Hello? Yeah, does that make you feel small? Yeah, you could put 1.3 billion Earths inside the sun. Does that give you some perspective? And but all the rest of these are sunspots. Now, what are sunspots? These are magnetic field occurrences on the surface of the sun. Now, the sun has a magnetic field, but it's very complex. But in addition to the actual magnetic field of the sun as a whole, well, on the surface, depending upon the year, nobody can predict it. Do you know what I tell my students in class? If a phone rings, it better be God. So, you're that kind of, yeah. Actually, that's what I do too, but I wasn't going to go that far. I have a really nice collection of cell phones from various years. Anyway, but cells, these spots you see here, this is extramagnetism that occurs on the surface of the sun. And I'm just going to try to illustrate this in the air, but what it looks like is loops of magnetism that look like an infinity sign. You know what the infinity sign looks like? And where the infinity sign crosses over, that's the surface of the sun. And because these loops, they come and they go. They grow and then they disappear and they come and they go. But where they cross over is on the surface. And because of that, it actually, I know this sounds funny, it actually causes the sun to be cooler at that spot, and it looks black. Of course, cooler is a relative word here. The surface of the sun itself on average is 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, that's why we're never going there. Not even at night. Hello? But the sun goes through 4 documented scientific cycles, and it does so at the same time. That is to say, all 4 cycles are occurring at the same time. And the one that most people are familiar with is the Schwab cycle. That's every 11 years. So typically, every 11 years, the sunspots go up in number, and then they go down in number. And as a matter of fact, right now we're in a point where it's called solar maximum, meaning that the number of sunspots right now is kind of hit the top of the 11-year cycle, and it's going to start going down again, okay? But that's the first one that you might have been taught about that in school. That's not uncommon. But there are 3 others that people seldom understand or know about. One is the Gleisberg cycle, where the sunspots tend to go up and down on a 75 to 90-year cycle. Then there's the Seuss cycle. You're all familiar with Dr. Seuss, right? Yeah, different dude. Anyway, that's every 200 to 500 years. And then finally, there's the Bond cycle, you know, James Bond. And that's every 1,100 to 1,500 years. And the sun is going through all these cycles at the same time. So what's going to happen? Well, sometimes one's going up and another one's going down, and they kind of cancel each other out. But sometimes one's going up and another one's going up too, and they kind of reinforce each other. But it's a very complex thing. Now, let's talk about good old Al Gore's book and movie. I actually prefer to call him Igor. Yeah, that's my pet name for him, Igor. But is there any truth in his movie? Well, you already know my opinion of it, which is no. The first casualty in this environmental terrorist movie is the truth. Now, the movie is full of total misinformation, half lies, and whole lies. Now, would you like to know my opinion of the movie? Let's think for a second. For instance, in the movie, he said that Lake Chad is disappearing. It's drying up as a direct result of global warming. And for instance, Lake Chad, that's in the Republic of Chad, Central Africa, northern part of Central Africa. But in 1973, the lake was the size of the state of Vermont, but in the year 2001, it was down to the size of Rhode Island. And he was saying that global warming caused by humans was causing the lake to disappear. But that is not true. The result it was actually drying up was because of an increase in population and an increase in irrigation for agriculture to support that population. And he also said the Aral Sea was drying up because of man-made global warming. The truth of the matter is, and I'd like you to pay special attention to the wisdom of communists. Back in the Soviet Union, under the USSR, the Soviets wanted to grow cotton down near the Aral Sea. At that time, there was a thriving fishing industry there, providing food for people, but they wanted to grow cotton. So what did they do? Well, they diverted 75% of the water flowing into the Aral Sea to grow cotton. As I will show you, today the lake is almost dry. There is no fishing industry and there is no cotton. Hello? Just to show you the wisdom of communists. Now, again, here are some of the fishing vessels on the dry part of the lake, which it really was. Aral Sea was just kind of a big lake. It's in Kazakhstan. I've ministered in Kazakhstan a couple of times. And so now there is no fishing village there at all. There's no fishing industry. He also said that Mount Kilimanjaro, and this is 2006, was hotter now than ever before. But the truth of the matter is it was actually colder than it was in 1970. Now, to show you some pictures, you might be able to make out the line. This is the line of the lake before they started diverting 75% of the water. And this picture was taken in the year 2000. Again, this is the edge of the lake before they started taking out the water for cotton. And this picture was taken in 2014. You can clearly see the lake is disappearing. No more fishing, no more food, no cotton. And Al Gore's movie, is there any truth in it? Well, no. The snow cap of Mount Kilimanjaro. By the way, any of you ever read Hemingway, The Snows of Mount Kilimanjaro? A couple of people? Okay. Very romantic thing and so forth. But let's take a little look. First of all, well, the snow cap on Mount Kilimanjaro, well, since 1895 to 1953, 45% of it had already gone away. But think with me for a second. We just came out of the little ice age in 1895. So it's been getting a little warmer, correct? So obviously the ice cap was melting back through totally normal, natural things, had nothing to do with people, except this is a photograph taken by a satellite of Mount Kilimanjaro. Now, it is a 19,000-foot high volcano, but notice here, you can even see the crater at the very top in this picture. This was taken February 1993, February being basically the coldest point when the ice is going to be its maximum. And again, this is, well, again, February 2000. So you can see here, in the 7 years, the ice has melted back. No question about it, right? However, I'm going to be sharing with you studies from Science Magazine, the second highest scientific journal in the world for evolutionists, the International Journal of Climatology, and the Journal of Geophysical Research. They said, because the forests around the mountains have been cut down by people and the increase in population, this reduces the humidity needed to build ice and snow. So what happens? There's trees around the mountain. But because of the population increase in that area and people wanting wood, they cut down the trees. Because they cut down the trees, there's less moisture rising up to the top of the mountain where it would freeze into ice and snow, okay? If global warming were true, it would save the snows of Mount Kilimanjaro because more vegetation would grow around the mountain, more humidity would go to the top of the mountain, we get more ice and snow. There's also one more problem. That's the year 2000 in February, correct? You can see that the snow and ice is almost gone, correct? But that's February 2021. I've noticed the ice and snow is back. You see, these things are variable. These are natural events that cycle. And think with me. Evolution say, well, we're going to prevent climate change. My next question to that is, okay, which climate are you going to change to? I don't know about you. There are certain climates I don't want to live in. Agreed? And secondly, think with me. If climate and weather over the long term did not fluctuate, it would be like a person being dead. Hello? So fluctuations are normal. They're natural. You should expect them. They're actually good. And what about the polar bears? In Al Gore's movie, he said that the polar bears were all going to die. Hello? Yeah, that they were going to get on icebergs, they were going to float off over the horizon, and they were going to drown and die. Now, I don't know about you, I find this kind of interesting. In the movie, to illustrate polar bears getting on icebergs, floating out over the horizon, drowning, he used animated bears. He used cartoons. Why? Because he couldn't get any pictures of it really happening. He just made it up. And let's talk about the truth concerning polar bears. Now, the environmental terrorists claim that polar bears are dying from global warming is simply not true. And let's take a look. I took this photograph, and I want you to look at the smile on that polar bear's face. I think he's smiling going, global warming? Ha! Anyway, I want to introduce you to the truth. You see, polar bear populations have been growing. From 1950 to 2023, polar bear populations they'd gone up 5 times, from 5,000 or 6,000, 7,000 to 30,000 polar bears today. This is a graph coming from the Canadian polar bear biologist, Dr. Taylor, showing the increase in polar bear population. Polar bear populations are increasing so fast at this time, they're leaving the polar regions. They're going further south into Canada and Alaska. They are fighting with grizzlies over territory and occasionally mating with them, which is producing a really big bear. Hello? And again, is there any truth in the movie? Well, no. Here's another picture of a polar bear taken. Again, I think he's going there. Global warming? You've got to be kidding. But I want to introduce you to Al Gore, who said that a polar bear cannot swim 60 miles. I quote from the movie. Now, this is Dr. Ian Sterling of the Canadian Wildlife Service. I think he knows a little bit more about polar bears than Mr. Gore. Hello? And Dr. Sterling said this: swimming 100 miles is not a big deal for a polar bear, especially a fat one. I tell you, never get your education from National Geographic, but I will also say they have some of the best wildlife photographers in the world. And you can get on YouTube, National Geographic, and they actually did a documentary on a female polar bear when she walked off into the water, swam 100 miles to an island you can't see, because it's a colony of seals and walruses, and she gorged herself. Hello? How did she know where that island was, 100 miles away that cannot be seen from the shore? And she went right to it. Well, again, Al Gore in his movie showed Pacific islands being evacuated because of the rising waters of melting ice caps. But to date, no Pacific island has ever been evacuated because of rising water. He just made it up and used movie stock footage to back it up. Don't you love the integrity of these people? Well, Al Gore's movie, is there any truth in it? No. The Arctic ice cap is not melting away. It's growing in total ice. Now, the surface is getting smaller, but the thickness is getting bigger. Here, this shows a graph from 1979 to 2020. It's one of the newest I can get. But this is the southern hemisphere sea ice extent, and it shows clearly an upward trend in the total amount of ice in the Antarctic, even though the area might be getting smaller by the melting of the edges. Again, the Upsala Glacier in Patagonia is retreating. However, 30 miles away, the Perito Moreno Glacier is advancing. In fact, nearby medium-sized glaciers are stable and large-sized glaciers are growing at this time. You know, Al Gore said the glaciers were all going to melt away. Well, think with me. Glaciers do recede and they do advance. And the reason for that is the amount of snow that falls at the top of the glacier. So if it's a drier year, there's going to be less ice and snow, and you may get some retreat. But if it's heavy snowfall, you'll get some advance. But glaciers are melting and advancing and retreating all the time in different places of the world, and even next to each other. As an example, here's a photograph of the Upsala Glacier. That's in Patagonia, that's in southern Argentina. The top photograph shows 1928, the bottom 2017. Clearly, the ice is melting away, receding, correct? Nobody doubts this. I agree with it completely. On the other hand, here is the Perito Moreno Glacier in Patagonia, only 30 miles away, showing you it's advancing, and you can see it knocking down trees in front of it, proving that it is advancing, correct? This is Pio the 11th, a glacier in Chile, but it's the largest glacier in South America. It is 3.5 miles across. This is a tourist boat right there, taking people up to the glacier where they can see it up close. Is that right? Oh, but when it reaches the water, it's 3.5 miles across. Now, notice down here, I'm again quoting from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, USA. It doesn't get higher than that in the United States, and dominated by evolutionists, by the way. But the reason that the glaciers are melting in some parts of the Andes, quote, climate change in the Venezuelan Andes is linked to changes in solar activity during the Little Ice Age, and, quote, solar variability is the primary underlying cause of the glacier fluctuations. Again, both forward and back. Again, I want to go to Dr. Lindzen. I really like this guy. You see, he says glaciers are advancing in the European Arctic. These are episodic events. The Arctic does occasionally get warmer and colder. Climate change is the norm. If you want something to worry about, it would be if the climate were static. It would be like a person being dead, as I mentioned earlier. How about Al Gore's movie? Is there any truth in it? No. He said that hurricanes were going to get stronger and stronger because of global warming. Now, I live in Florida, and occasionally we have hurricanes, and we had one go by us just this year. 2004, I had 3 go right straight over my house. It's not the most pleasant thing to endure, I assure you. But he said that hurricanes were going to increase because of global warming. And, of course, hurricanes feed off of warm water in the Atlantic. They come off, hot air comes off the Sahara Desert across the warm water of equatorial, the Atlantic Ocean, and turns and they start to go north and so on. It's typical. But let's just take a little look at the truth. This shows you what has happened since 1850 in 10-year increments. You see, we don't have any accurate records before 1850. That's when we started keeping accurate records. Now, we have anecdotal things like the destruction of a Spanish treasure fleet in a particular year. We know exactly when that happened. But that's not tracking all the hurricanes that year or the year before or the year after. So we only know of some specific ones. But in 1850, we started counting them on a regular basis, affecting the U.S. And you'll notice from 1851 to 1860, well, there's a fair number here. But then it goes way down the next decade, but then it starts going up again, and it's typically fluctuating correctly. As a matter of fact, when was one of the highest periods known, decade, of hurricane activity? Well, it was 1941 to 1950. How come you don't know that that was the highest decade of hurricane activity in the last, since 1850. Could it be because we were more worried about lead poisoning than hurricanes? If you don't get the reference, it's called World War II. Hello? That's why I call it lead poisoning. Hello? But we were involved with World War II. We weren't really that worried about hurricanes, were we? Oh, but since the decade of the World War II period, in general, the trend has been going down, not up. Why? Because the Earth is cooling over millennia. Now, this is not something that is causing climate change and fluctuations that we understand. But when God created the Earth, He created it with a certain amount of heat inside. It's like a big hot rock, and it's radiating more heat into space than we get every day. And so in a very general, slow process, the Earth itself is cooling. The oceans are cooling since the time of the flood. And so what's happening? As the oceans are cooling very slowly over 4,500 years of time, there's less energy to support the hurricanes. And so there might be plenty in number, but they're of no harm. Or we might have a year with less, etc. But the general trend has been going down, and really since the time of the Dust Bowl. I said I was going to share just a couple of verses. If you'll take a look at Amos 4:7. Furthermore, I withheld the rain from you while there was still 3 months until harvest. Then I would send rain on one city, and on another city I would not send rain. One part would be rained on, while the other part not rained on would dry up. I know you've seen this, but in Florida we see it all the time. It'll rain on one side of the street and not the other, and we see it all the time in Florida. But God is in charge of the weather, and God uses weather to bless or to chastise. And so it's actually a tool by which He chastises or blesses people. And He's in charge of the weather. Hello? What about Al Gore's movie? Is there any truth in it? Well, you already know the answer. But no, let's think about this. Environmental terrorists claim that the Gulf Stream is going to stop flowing because of man-made global warming. As a matter of fact, in his movie, Al Gore said, and I will basically quote him, the Gulf Stream is going to stop flowing because of global warming. I mean, he actually made that ridiculous statement. I would like all of you to pay attention to this. There are 7 oceans in the world, but the 2 polar oceans simply turn in the same direction continuously. But there are 5 oceans between the 2, and think with me. In the Atlantic, in the Pacific, well, the currents go clockwise. You know, the Gulf Stream comes Africa, up by Florida, then up to Nova Scotia, over to Greenland, Iceland, England, back down to Africa. It's clockwise. The same thing is true of the Japanese current in the northern Pacific. But the 3 oceans in the south, well, again, these turn counterclockwise. So the Humboldt current, for instance, that comes up along Chile and so forth, goes across to Australia, back down again and over, well, they turn counterclockwise, also in the Indian Ocean. Now, why? Well, in order for these oceans to stop rotating, well, the Earth would have to stop rotating. Excuse me? Think with me. Why do the northern 2 oceans go clockwise and the 3 southern oceans go counterclockwise? It's because the Earth rotates that way. It's the Earth's rotation that causes them to spin. And the only way that the Gulf Stream would ever stop rotating is if the Earth stopped rotating. Hello? Well, let's continue. I hope you're finding this somewhat interesting. Again, I'm going to go back to Dr. Lindzen, who's a true authority on climate. He said, future generations will wonder in bemused amazement that the early 21st century's developed world went into hysterical panic over a globally average temperature increase of a few tenths of a degree, and on the basis of gross exaggerations of highly uncertain computer projections, combined into implausible chains of inference, proceeded to contemplate a rollback of the industrial age. I really like that guy. Says it like it is, don't you think? Well, what are the top myths of environmental terrorists? Well, number one, it's hot in here. At least that's what they say. Hello? But let's think about this. And again, this comes from the infamous National Geographic, from which you should never, ever get your education. But to promote this movie, they wrote this: the planet is heating up and fast. Glaciers are melting, sea levels are rising, cloud forests are drying, and wildlife is scrambling to keep up. It's becoming clear that humans have caused most of the past century's warming by releasing heat-trapping gases as we power our modern lives. Called greenhouse gases, their levels they're higher now than in the last 650,000 years. Now, what is the first question you should ask when somebody says 650,000 years ago? You don't know the first question? Oh, no. The first question is, were you there? How do you know? Were you there? And then, of course, how would you measure it too? But were you there? The answer is no, right? Well, they continued, and I want you to get the rest of this. They continued in this National Geographic article to say, what will we do as this slow warming? How will we cope with changes we've already set into motion? While we struggle to figure it all out, the face of the earth as we know it hangs in the balance. Ooh. Hello? I hope you're enjoying this as much as I do. Anyway, they say it's hot in here. Okay, it's hot in here. Since when? Think with me. Compared to when? It's cooler now than it was in the 1930s. That's during the Dust Bowl. It's cooler now than it was during the 3 previous warm periods on Earth, as I showed you. Remember this chart right here, right? And it's been much warmer 3 times on Earth than today, and humans had nothing to do with that. Number 2, the 1990s were the hottest decade on record, according to the evolutionary believing environmentalists. Gore said that 10 of 14 years prior to his movie coming out were the hottest on record, and that 2005, the year before his movie, was the hottest year ever. But the National Academy of Sciences debunked it that fall. It's not true. Take a look. These are the averages for certain months in the past, and July temperatures. Notice that here was the hottest in 1936, and others were much cooler, including before his movie came out. Actually, the National Academy of Sciences miscalculated their own data. The truth is that 6 of the 10 years that were the hottest on record came before 1954. The 1930s were particularly toasty, but 1938 was actually the hottest year on record, according to the National Climate Data Center. Number 3, the science is settled. CO2 causes global warming. Well, first of all, let's think about this. Al Gore said the science is settled, that all scientists believe it, correct? But tell me something. If it's settled science, well, historically, CO2 increases after global warming, not before it. You see, the earth warms, then you get more vegetation growing, and then it releases more carbon dioxide. So you don't get an increase in carbon dioxide before, you get it after as an effect of the warming and the increase in plants growing, okay? Number 2, if it is settled science, why are we spending $5 billion more each year to research it? I mean, if it's settled, couldn't we save the $5 billion? I'd like to. And number 3, attempting to stifle debate is inherently anti-scientific. To suggest that something is settled science is to say we shouldn't research it any further, correct? But if you do that, it's actually anti-scientific, because you would want to research it to make sure whether you were right or not, just to start with, and you would then pick up the times it goes down versus up. And again, what is the top myths of environmental terrorism? Well, number 4, the climate was stable until man came along. That is a totally false statement. What you see here is the poster child of his movie. This is what's referred to as the hockey stick. because it's straight and then suddenly goes like that. So it kind of looks like a hockey stick laying on the ground, right? This was a preposterous thing done by Dr. Mann, who had nothing but a political agenda, but this was used in Al Gore's movie to say that the temperatures were stable for the last 1,000 years, but only recently, basically because of the Industrial Revolution, it suddenly started getting a whole lot hotter, right? That's what he used, right? Now, if you were paying attention to what I had just shown you, what's wrong with this graph? Anybody see it? That's not the problem. Look one more time. 1,000 years of relatively steady temperatures and then a sudden increase, right? Well, if you didn't pick it up, please tell me, where is the medieval warm period that should be right here? He simply erased the medieval warm period. This is a total fabrication. This is a lie. This is absolute total deception. Where is the medieval warm period? He simply erased it and fabricated this chart. Think with me. This is for, well, the years leading up to 2021. Actually, what we see since the Little Ice Age ended about 1895, relatively stable numbers of sunspots and the temperature on the Earth. And this is just roughly the last 44 years. But you'll notice there are a couple of ups and downs, but there's also the downs here. And here again is Dr. Mann's chart, but where is the medieval warm period here? Again, I want to show you. This is supposed to be the year 1000. That's the middle of the medieval warm period. But where is it? He simply erased it because it's missing, but should be there. Is that correct? Ah, don't you love the integrity of these people? Another myth, the glaciers are melting. Glaciers are also advancing all over the Earth, even the same areas that glaciers are receding. Global warming and global cooling cannot both be true at the same time. And again, to support my statement, this is a glacier in the Tonga National Forest, near Juneau Icefield. It's near Juneau. Here, you can actually see it advancing into these trees, and these are trees it's killing and knocking over here. So clearly, this glacier near Juneau, Alaska is going forward. Here again, this is the Mears Glacier. Now, this photograph was taken back in 2000, but again, you can see that the ice is going forward and knocking down trees, correct? Now, this is a picture I did not take, but the Hole-in-the-Wall Glacier in 1932 in the Tongass National Forest. You can see where the glacier is there, correct? But I did take this photograph in 2007. And you can clearly see that the glacier is moving forward. Is that correct? Ah. And then, just to check and see if you're observing, this is the Trapridge Glacier in the Yukon Territory of Canada. And notice, currently it is advancing, and this ice wall at the front is 70 meters, roughly 225 foot high. But did you notice this glacier is advancing, and this glacier, the Donjek Glacier, again in the Yukon Territory, it is also advancing at this time. But would you please notice the gray here and here in front of these two glaciers? What does that tell you? Excellent. See, you are the A students that came tonight. It shows you that's the rock that was dropped by the glacier the last time it receded, but that means the glacier was there before and then receded, but now it's moving back forward again, right? And there's the evidence to prove. Number 6 on our hit parade, climate change is raising sea levels. Even the United Nations, the good Lord knows if they tell you that it's got to be true, right? But their International Panel on Climate Change found no statistical significant change in the rate of increase over the past century. Australia and New Zealand report no increase in sea level and may even be seeing a slight sea drop. As I'm going to point out again, if the Earth were warming, and I said if, right? Then you would melt more ice, you would evaporate more water, and that water would be transferred to the land, and it would come down as rain, ice, and snow. So if global warming were true, then the ocean level should go down. Hello? Oh, a little science goes a long way. The latest research suggests that sea levels would decline, not rise, if temperatures rise due to an increase in evaporation from the oceans and subsequent precipitation on the land. Number 7, climate change, they say, is the greatest threat to the world's poor. And goodness only knows, the current president has said that it is our single greatest existential problem. Is that right? War is not it. It's climate change that he says is our greatest existential threat. Agreed? Well, let's think about this. They claim that climate change is the greatest threat to the world's poor. Climate and weather patterns have always changed, and they always will. Advanced societies adapt best with superior infrastructure and unrationed access to energy. Poor societies suffer because of a lack of infrastructure and the rationing of access to energy. Well, I hope that really hits home, because what we have today is a rationing of energy, correct? But we ought to be just opening the spigot. And what are the problems in measuring global warming or global cooling? Well, number 1, the most powerful tools science has developed to predict climate and weather changes are computer models. That should stop you right there. Computer models are recognized as consistently and inherently flawed because of the bias of the programmer to get the desired results. All of you familiar with garbage in and garbage out, right? GIGO? Well, how can environmental terrorists predict climate and weather conditions 20, 50, 100 years ahead of time when they cannot, reliably predict it's going to rain next Thursday? Hello? Think with me for just a moment. There are more than 30 major climate models in use today. No 2 of them agree on the exact same results. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go back to hurricane season. Now, I know you don't have to worry about hurricanes much, although you do get them off the Pacific, and you get a remnant now and then, I know. But think with me for a minute. In Florida, of course, that's another story. But think with me. You have seen the Weather Channel or some weather report, and they will show you, here's a hurricane that has developed in the Atlantic, right? And then they show you the cone of uncertainty. Anybody here remember Maxwell Smart? Yeah. The cone of uncertainty. And they'll show you 5, 6, 7 models, and 4 or 5 kind of in the middle tend to go in the same general direction. But then there's one on either side that simply goes, that's a technical term, in case you're not familiar with it. Yeah, the 2 on the outside go, right? Weather is too complicated to predict accurately with computer models. And what are the problems in measuring global cooling, global warming, etc.? Well, in the 1990s, global warming, as described by the environmental terrorists, coincided with the closing of thousands of temperature reporting stations, mostly in the colder parts of Russia. If you leave out the temperatures from the colder parts of the world, the averages will obviously go up. I have spent many winters in Siberia, where if you think you know about cold, it's minus 40 continuously. Hello? But that's southern Russia, where it's warm. You fly 1,000 miles north to Yakutia, it's minus 70. But that's not the coldest. If you go east of there in a mountain range that separates Siberia from the Russian, what's called the Far East, there's a mountain range there where the temperature in the wintertime hits minus 100. So if you think you know something about cold, you don't know about cold. Hello? But think with me, if you've got these weather stations out there and the Soviet Union folded, they didn't have the money to pay to keep these stations open or keep them maintained or reading the readings. And so they closed tons of them. Well, if you close tons of those stations, then obviously your averages are going to go up. Is that correct? But there's more to it than that. From 1989 to 2000, 4,000 of the 6,000 of the world's temperature recording stations were closed mostly in the former Soviet Union. At the same time, the average global temperature for that decade went up by 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit because you threw out all the cold ones, right? Isn't that an interesting coincidence? What is the historically correct perspective? At this time, the northern hemisphere is cooling slightly. The southern hemisphere is actually warming slightly. As a matter of fact, there's a chart showing you the weather in the northern hemisphere going up southern hemisphere, excuse me, going up slightly, but it's not a big deal, and it's normal. Again, what is the historically correct perspective, and what causes climate changes? In September of 2006, the year Al Gore's movie came out, a publication of New Scientist. Now, New Scientist is a really vitriolic evolutionary publication supporting total evolution, I assure you. But they said this: it is the prolonged lulls in the sun's activity, the sunspots and dramatic flares that are driven by its powerful magnetic field. So that's what causes climate changes. So it is the sun, S-U-N, hello? And these are the sunspot cycles since the time that Galileo actually first discovered them. So when Galileo started developing telescopes and he started taking a look at the sun, he's the first person to actually document sunspot activity. And he caught it at a really good time 400 years ago, because here you'll notice he starts observing them, and they go up and then down, and they kind of pitter around. And then there's this 50-year period right here, roughly 1640 to 1690, called the Maunder Minimum, when for almost 50 years there was not a single sunspot on Earth, and the Earth cooled. Remember the little ice age. A little ice age is going from roughly 1250, 1300 to 1895. So in 1610, Galileo starts seeing sunspots. So he's starting to get these numbers in the little ice age period, correct? Then the sunspots started coming back again, going up and down in relatively 11-year cycles until 1800. From 1800 to 1830, there were two short sunspot cycles here. Now, this was basically the end of the bottom of the little ice age. From then it would start to warm. But 1800 to 1830, if you know anything about your American history, you remember when George Washington took the Continental Army into winter headquarters at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. It was a brutal winter. And when Washington attacked the Hessians in Trenton, New Jersey, the boats that they took across the Delaware River had to go around the icebergs. When was the last time you heard of an iceberg in the Delaware River? Hello? This is the time when in England they had in London what were called frost fairs. Frost fairs were when the Thames froze over hard enough that you could ice skate on it, and they put portable kiosks out on the ice, and they sold hot crust buns to the skaters. Now, when was the last time you heard of the Thames freezing over? Excuse me? Oh. Now, I cannot predict. I don't know. Only God knows. Are you with me? I can tell you that we're peaking out on the second of a low cycle of sunspot activity at this time, somewhat similar to the one from 1800 to 1830. And if that is what happens, well, you're going to start seeing the Earth get cooler, and in a few years you're going to want to buy a heavier coat. I'm not predicting that because we have to wait and see. Hello? But what are the facts really about recent global temperatures? Well, number one, in summary, according to environmental terrorists, from 1895 to 1930, we had catastrophic natural global cooling. But from 1830 to 1954, we had catastrophic natural global warming. But from 1854 to 1980, we had catastrophic man-made global cooling. As a matter of fact, at the end of the 70s, they were predicting we were going to go into the next ice age and we were all going to die. In my book, I have a chapter on this material. I even quote from various publications, 77, at that time frame, about how the Earth was getting so much colder that we were going to go into the next ice age. But of course, by 1980, they figured out that wasn't true. They actually figured out we were getting slightly warmer at that point. However, from 1980 to 2023, we have experienced what they call catastrophic man-made global warming. Please notice, if you would, according to these environmental terrorists, they change their opinion every 25 to 35 years on a regular basis. Hello? I just hope you guys are getting as much out of this. And what are the potential benefits if global warming were actually true? I mean, people tend to think, oh, global warming, that's terrible. But actually, global warming would be beneficial, and I don't like it warm. Hello? But I'm simply saying, from a humanity standpoint, we would all be better off if the Earth really were warming up. And why? Well, first of all, the fabled Northwest Passage between the Atlantic and Pacific would become a reality, would cut shipping time in half. In the year 2005, in August, the Russian ship Academic Fyodorov became the first ship to cross the North Pole without the use of an icebreaker. But that was 2005. In the pictures that you see here, these are satellite pictures showing September of, this is 1979, this is 2003. You can see the ice is melting back in the Arctic. However, take a close look. Again, why do we deal with August, September? Because this is the time of the end of the summer in the Arctic, so this is when the ice is going to be back as far as it's going to go. Because in the winter, it reforms, okay? Dark, cold. Here we are in August of 2012. Clearly, there's a lot of ice that has melted back. But here in August of 2013, the very next year, it had increased back by over 500,000 square miles. You see how fast these things can change. Again, this is 1979, 2012, 2017. These photographs are from NASA, and so you paid for them. Enjoy them. Hello? What are the potential benefits of global warming were true? Well, let's think about this. 2,000 years of published human histories say that the warm periods were good for people. It was the harsh, unstable dark ages and the little ice age that brought bigger storms, untimely frost, widespread famine, and plagues of disease. Think with me. If the Earth were actually warming, we could grow crops further north, further south. We could produce more feed for people, and, well, it would actually be beneficial. It's when it gets cold that you can't grow as much food. You can't grow it as far north, as far south. Somebody asked a really good question earlier. How do we know about these temperatures? Well, obviously, for the last 200 years, we've had thermometers and barometers, you know that. But how do we know that the rest of it's true past that time frame? Well, it's really very simple. First of all, we have written records of people saying this was a particularly cold winter or a particularly hot one, but that's anecdotal, correct? But what does prove it? Well, think with me for a moment. Artists paint what they see during their lifetimes. And when you take a look at the Renaissance, you see sunny skies. But when you take a look at the 14th century, they have cloudy, dark skies outside the windows in their paintings, proving again that it was much colder, darker, etc., right? And then, of course, we have the written records of where crops were grown. Now, certain crops will only grow within a certain temperature range. And so when we know how far north wheat was being produced, we know how warm the temperature was. Again, the Egyptians, for thousands of years, have accurately tracked the level of the Nile River. Well, if you know the level of the Nile River, which was very important, well, then we know how much rain was falling in Central Africa. You see, there are ways of knowing what the temperatures were, the climate conditions were, by written records, by records of crops, water levels, etc. And so it really is possible to do this accurately. Again, what actually causes global warming? It's not people. You see, greenhouse gases, such as naturally occurring water vapor, which actually warms the earth as much as 95% of the heat trapped in the atmosphere, at least 78% or more. And I don't know about you, but the last time I looked, water is not a greenhouse gas and rather essential for life. Is that correct? Oh. Then, of course, we do have CO2, methane, ozone, nitrous oxide. These do have a warming effect. But carbon dioxide has been as much as 10 times higher in the atmosphere than today, according to evolutionists, okay? Now, think with me for a moment. What is the truth about these gases? CO2 is not a major greenhouse gas. It is only less than 0.04% of the entire atmosphere. It is a natural byproduct of humans and animals. It is released by plants upon death. Methane is 28 more times efficient in trapping heat than CO2, and carbon monoxide is 3.3 times more concerning the warming than carbon dioxide. But nitrous oxide initially warms, but additional amounts of it actually cause it to cool. As a matter of fact, I could show you the chart. If you have an atmosphere that has no carbon dioxide in it whatsoever, and you add 20 parts per million carbon dioxide, there will be an immediate increase in heat because carbon dioxide does, in fact, warm, okay? But if you add 20 more, if you go to 40 million parts per million, then it warms a little more, but not as much. And then you add another 20, and it warms, but not as much. And it doesn't take long before you get parallel to the bottom axis, and we could dump carbon dioxide in the atmosphere today, and we would get no additional warming. What should we be doing? We should be releasing the carbon dioxide that has been sequestered. Think with me. The plants would simply absorb it, and we need a growing food supply for a growing population. The people who are sequestering carbon dioxide and wanting you to produce less and less of it are actually starving people to death. Hello? Oh. Methane is produced in swamps, bogs, rice paddies, cows, and humans at both ends. I'll let you dwell on that one for a minute. Greenhouse gases are necessary for life to exist on Earth. Without them, we'd freeze to death. You are not alive today because of the heat which comes in from the sun every day. You're alive today because of the heat which comes in from the sun every day, plus the heat passing you on the way out from that big hot rock we're on. And we need those gases to trap the heat because otherwise it would just be radiated back into space. And so actually greenhouse gases are good for us in many ways. Man-made combustion of fuels causes only 2% of the greenhouse gases that keep our atmosphere habitable. The other 98% are produced by purely natural causes, one of the biggest being volcanic eruptions. Some of you might remember Mount Pinatubo, 1991 in the Philippines. It was a massive eruption, put approximately 20 million tons of aerosols and various volatiles into the Earth's atmosphere. The Earth warmed 1.7 degrees Fahrenheit in 1 year because of that. Please tell me, if you want to prevent global warming, you'd want to prevent volcanoes, so how many of you believe you can actually legislate against a volcano? Oh, come on, folks, I only ask the good question, you know. And what causes global cooling? Well, volcanic eruptions. I mentioned Mount Pinatubo just now, and this is what it looked like. It just popped its cork. It was like a champagne bottle. It just went boom. Here, showing the temperature decline of the atmosphere in only 1 year. But dust storms also, of course, particularly like the Dust Bowl times, but that blocked out 15% of the sunlight and actually dropped the temperature 1 degree. So you tend to think of the Dust Bowl being particularly hot. No, it was particularly dry. But actually the Earth was cooling at the time. By the way, and it was caused primarily because of a period of extended El Niños. But the Earth's orbit varies. We have a relatively circular orbit, but it's not circular. It does vary, and we get a little closer to the sun, a little further away from the sun, and that does cause the earth to warm slightly, cool slightly, but it is, again, slight. I want to keep that word in mind, okay? And what actually causes global cooling? Well, the smoke from forest fires. The earth itself is cooling on a continuous basis and decreases variations in solar activity, the sunspot activity going up and down. Now, this is a synopsis. There's much, much more to this. But the fact of the matter is that the environmental terrorists are simply using natural, normal cycles to try to use it to prevent people from doing things, to control people. It's basically 1984 all over again. But I hope that you've at least enjoyed the presentation, gotten something out of it, something you can take home. And I want to thank Pastor for allowing me to share that with you.